Well, big news from the Victorian government today, a $3 billion package announced for business. But the shutdown continues in Victoria.
Well, it turns out, though, that Westpac is sticking to its upward revision of growth forecasts that emerged before the extended shutdown was announced. Westpac senior economist Matt Hassan explains why.
So what we're seeing, particularly with the high frequency data around card transactions, payrolls and mobility information, the feared second wave contraction in Victoria doesn't look quite as severe as initially thought. So obviously the lockdown in August was quite a bit heavier than the first lockdown in April, May. But so far the spending flows through our card transactions have held up pretty well. That's a combination of Victoria has definitely weakened. There's a shock there, but not quite as dramatic as we thought that Victoria, the state economy, would contract by about 9%. Looks more likely to be in the range of 4%. And the reopening that's coming through in the other states is providing a little bit more of an offset. So net, the quarter looks like a decent gain.
Okay,
for GDP.
so it's going to go up. It's not going to decline. I know some economists fear that it'll shrink further, but
that's right. Well, with our card data, for example, we now have figures up to the first week in September. So the flows overall nationally have held the line through August, and it's hard to expect a real fall away at this stage. So, and you'd need something pretty dramatic for the quarter as a whole to really go backwards.
Yeah. Well, since you made those forecast changes, of course, the Victorian government last week has put out its roadmap. It's certainly been a very controversial roadmap. Some people say it's too confusing, it's too long, and potentially it could mean that Victoria stays in lockdown for many, many weeks yet. Does that maybe affect, the probabilities around your forecast?
Look, obviously it's a negative at the margin. The central cases of a very gradual reopening, another month by the looks of it, of quite heavy lockdown measures, and even then quite a slow reopening from there. It is hard to understand. I think there's so many contingencies in there. Where we land in terms of case numbers determines a lot of what happens going forward. At the margin, though, yeah, I think that's a negative for the state. I mean, there's a more prolonged period of weakness. At the moment, it doesn't look like that'll shift the dial nationally. But what's already clearly emerging is that we have a 2 or 3 speed rebound in the economy at the moment. You've got states like Western Australia, which are powering ahead, which are almost back to pre-COVID levels. New South Wales, obviously, things have been a little bit more nervous around here with a few clusters. And then right at the back, that's really hasn't even finished contracting is Victoria.
In terms of the forecast for next year, for 2021, to what extent does that depend on a vaccine arising? Because, of course, we heard this week that one of the promising vaccines is actually being put on hold for a few more months. So does that concern you?
It does. Obviously, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with the vaccine side of things. It's a very compressed time frame, and there's a few important things around the longevity of a vaccine treatment. How long does immunity last, and also keeping on board the public. We need to be able to vaccinate a majority of people for these things to work. So we're watching that pretty closely. Our central case is that we'll get something most likely in the first half of next year. Some of the timelines look completely unrealistic, but there's enough in there, even with this pause around AstraZeneca. There's enough sort of vaccines being phase 3 research being done on vaccines at the moment, and the timelines, the guidance that we've been given is the first half of next year. We kind of have to just take that on trust at this stage.
Now, just turning to the job market, of course, which will be in big focus next week when the latest jobless figure comes out. But we did hear this week that from the ABS's payroll data, that the number of jobs around the country actually shrank over the 4 weeks to the end of August. And of course, you'd probably expect that in Victoria because of the lockdown, but it also shrank in all the other states too, slightly. Does that worry you?
It does a little bit. So I think some of the reopening momentum faded a little bit through August. And I think part of that was, we did have a shock to confidence at the start of the month. If you go back 4 weeks, we had the lockdown announced for Victoria, and the concern elsewhere was that this would be the beginning of a second wave that spread throughout the country. And I think that did lead to a fair bit of nervousness, particularly in states like New South Wales. Again, though, our reading of that is that the weekly payrolls data is still not quite as weak as we feared in Victoria, and spending definitely has held up better. So I think, I think we're still working through the wobbly reopening phase, and as you said, the momentum loss in August looks a little bit iffy, but I think we're still okay.
Also, just in terms of the official jobless rate for August, where do you see that landing? I think it was 7.4% in July. Government thinks it's going to be 10% by the end of the year, I think. What's going to happen for August, you think?
So we'll continue to see a push higher. Very hard to pinpoint the jobless rate at the moment because you've got all these JobKeeper and JobSeeker policy factors in the mix. We think it'll nudge up to around 7.7 for the month of August, and it will continue to push higher, but we don't see it going all the way to 10%. You know, our growth forecasts are quite a bit more constructive now than the government's. We think we'll top out nearer 8% than 10%. That's still a pretty difficult labour market, and there'll be plenty of hangover from that into 2021. So it's not clear sailing from here. But certainly, you know, the message that we've seen, aside from these high-frequency data points around spending and jobs, you know, the real shift for us was around the second quarter, you know, where we got the national accounts, big contraction in activity. But when you look at the income side, you know, the household sector was overcompensated, right? You know, fiscal stimulus and fiscal supports provided more to the household sector than the hit to wage incomes. So we think they're actually in reasonably good shape to re-engage as we go back into reopening. There's going to be other legacies, of course. You know, we've got to negotiate a very large wave of likely business failures over the next year and a half. That'll be a definite restraint on growth. And the economy as a whole, we don't see it coming all the way back to pre-COVID levels, even by the end of next year. So we're still on a weak economy. It's not quite as difficult as it looked a few weeks ago.
Thanks very much, Matthew.
Thanks.